No, oh no.
Caroline, Ursula, would it be okay to try for Ursula to try to share again her screen, just to make sure that it's not the same hiccup will not happen again?
So it's not the issue is there was no issues with sharing screen. The issue is that someone clicked on start broadcast, which now means that the webinar is live. So if attendees start to join, they will hear our private conversation.
Okay.
So we can do it. We still have a few minutes. No one has joined yet. So we can do a quick check with the screen sharing for everyone, and then we should just all keep ourselves muted until it's 10 o'clock, and then we'll just start.
Okay, okay.
So no big stress. Don't worry.
All right. Thank you.
Good morning, Anne. Can you hear me?
Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Hi, this is Diana. Fine. Glad I could join. How is everyone?
Doing well. Good. Yeah, everything is good. So I would suggest that we just do a quick round of sharing screens one last time. So Anne, I gave you the screen.
Yeah. On my side, I tried directly with the phone. I stopped trying the other option.
Yeah. If you have the slides, Deanna, I think it's fine. Thanks so much.
Yeah, I have them.
The phone. I realize that it's not as comfortable, I think, to be in through your phone.
It's not ideal. It's
No.
a bit less functionalities, but it works well. So that's the important part. Yeah, I was looking at the slides. They look fine. It's just that there are quite many.
Yeah. I don't think that we'll spend too much time on all of them.
So yeah, it means it has to go quickly through all that.
Yeah, exactly. And did you receive the request to, or the invitation to share your screen?
I think that does not concern me.
No. Hello, Anne? Okay. I don't hear you, so I'm just going to put myself on mute now.
Perhaps just to check, I don't know if you are doing something else on screen or so on. I do not hear anymore anything. I hope it's not my connection making problems.
Hi, Deanna. No, it's not. We're all just waiting to kick off now. We'll start in just a moment.
Then that's perfect. That's what I thought, but I just wanted to be sure.
No, it's fine. Thanks. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar today on carbon performance and real estate value. Today, we are going to be looking to answer the question, how to measure the potential of investing in low carbon buildings. I thank you all very much for your interest and for joining us on this sunny day, and I hope you all have a coffee and are settled in to hear some very interesting presentations. My name is Caroline Milne. I'm Senior Communications Manager at BPIE, and I've been in touch with all of you individually. And I'm just going to go through a couple housekeeping items this morning so you know how to participate and follow along with today's webinar. So here, this is a screenshot of what you're seeing on your screen. To the left is the GoToWebinar viewer through which you see the presentation, and to the right is the control panel where you can ask questions and select the audio mode. Please just note that the control panel will collapse automatically when it's not in use. To keep it open, you can click the View menu and uncheck Auto Hide Control Panel. Regarding your participation here, you can see a screenshot of an example of the attendee interface. So you should see something that looks like this on your computer desktop in the upper right corner. You're listening in using your computer's speaker system by default. If you have connection issues, or as many of us are having lately, or if you would prefer to join over the phone, you can select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. And there are also, there's a handouts section, so you can find the whole slide deck for today's presentations available for download now. So again, if you have issues, I would suggest downloading the slides as soon as possible, noting the phone number, and then you can still follow along and join using the slides on your desktop. Finally, regarding questions today, please use the questions box to type in your questions. We will have designated time for questions to take them throughout the presentations, and please also, if you are looking to direct your question to a specific person, just mention who it's for. It will help us organize things better. And if you have any other questions that we don't manage to address today, feel free to send me an email, and I'll also be sending today's presentation within the next 48 hours. If there's anything that you want to review or see again, it will be available. So on the agenda today, just a quick introduction of our speakers. We will first have Suzanne Bullman, who is Senior Finance Manager for Energy Efficiency from DENEFF, who will be introducing the project that between DENEFF, PricewaterhouseCoopers, and BPIE. The next presentation will be from my colleague Ivan Janovic, who is Senior Project Manager at BPIE. He will be presenting the regulatory environment and policy trends that are now affecting carbon exposure of the real estate sector. We will then go on to a presentation from Dr. Ann Michaels, who is Manager of Sustainability Services at PWC, and she will be giving a very in-depth presentation on the tool itself, and there will be time right after her presentation for questions because I'm sure that many of you might have some questions. Following that, we will have a reaction from 2 experts who will be facilitated by my colleague Jolt Toth. So Jolt will be presenting the experts in due time, and then we'll finally have an open Q&A with the audience where we'll look to address all of your questions. So please do keep them coming, and we will do our best to get to everything and to also end the webinar in a timely fashion at or before 11:30, because I know you all have other things to do with your day. So without further ado, I will let my colleague Suzanne kick off with the first introductory presentation of the project itself. Suzanne, the floor is yours.
Oh, thanks a lot. I hope everybody can hear me properly. Yeah, thanks a lot for the opportunity to introduce you to our project and some first results today. My name is Suzanne Bollmann. I'm responsible at DENEFF for all questions of green finance, sustainable finance, and financing energy efficiency. And also my colleague Martin is in the line. We will be happy to get your feedback on our first pilot project we had on questions of how much or how does carbon performance can influence the value of real estate. So we have prepared a very short presentation for you. Just some first information about the project, the main questions we have discussed with practitioners in the last 15 months now. I hope you can see my screen. Can you just give me a short feedback then?
We're having issues. I can put them.
So you cannot see my screen?
Suzanne, we're having, I think, an issue seeing your screen, but I have your slides, so I'm happy to share from my desktop.
Okay.
Just please tell me when to change slides.
Okay, so now I'm on the second slide. Just for your information, who's DENEFF? DENEFF, actually, we are a strong voice for energy efficiency in Germany. So we are a non-for-profit organization and network with more than 170 members from all kinds of suppliers, consultants, and service providers in the field of energy efficiency. For your information, so the third slide, maybe some introductory words on the current situation, as you may know. So if even if climate change is currently not on our agenda, or maybe not top priority in our daily lives, it will not disappear. So our mantra is climate protection will become even more important during and after the corona crisis or any other crisis that may occur. So we need to be prepared, and we need to better recognize the positive effects of climate protection measures. So what does it mean in detail? So next slide, please, Caroline. Thanks a lot. So what does it mean in detail? For example, for commercial real estate, commercial real estate is responsible for a large share of the European building sector's carbon emissions, as you may know. And therefore, action in this field is key for reaching the Paris climate targets. And what if we do not cope with the challenges? The real estate sector can be massively affected by future interventions, for example. The non-residential buildings count for approximately 50% of all sectors' emissions, and those emissions have to be cut by almost half until 2050. And in order to meet our targets, so there's still a lot to do. Next slide, please. So it's the slide. The next one, please. So it's your 10th slide, my 5th slide. Yes, right. And just yeah, an example from other sectors. What if we do not cope with the challenges? there might be a huge risk of devaluation of assets, as you may have seen in other sectors, like for the coal industry or even for automotive. So the mantra is we need to take care about not losing the speed for climate protection measures. Next slide, please. So we are convinced current developments with regard to climate change and climate policies will significantly affect the value of assets, such as buildings. Next slide, please. So what does it mean in detail? Where are we now? So far, building owners and property valuers sense that there might be an advantage of low carbon buildings, for example, on the cash flow basis. But actually, and currently, they do not know exactly how to calculate it, and even though they are allowed to do so. Though we have possibilities to include carbon performance, but actually we do not know how and why. And some already integrate sustainability in their valuation, but today it's still not a critical factor when it comes to acquisition, lending, or financing a building. Next slide, please. So what we have done in the last couple of months, in order to bridge the gap between sensing a future risk or opportunity and the ability to calculate the two, we initiated the project together with PWC and BPIE. The project has been funded by the Relevance Foundation, thanks a lot, and the German Federal Foundation for the Environment. So our objectives was we need a common understanding among the sector. We need a standardized approach and robust information about the real impact of carbon footprint on the value of a building. So next slide, please. Together with real estate experts, valuers, we discussed and analyzed common valuation schemes and developed a simple yet transparent approach. And now we have a tool to integrate carbon performance. So with focus on the German market, this will be extended in the next couple of years. We collaborated with leading valuation companies, asset holders, financial institutions, including real-life portfolio tests of the developed method. So today we would like to discuss the results in the tool. Just for your information, the project approach, we have chosen 2 more slides just for rough introduction. Anne will go into deeper in the next couple of minutes. Next slide, please. So our first question in the project was, what is the value of a building and why sustainability can influence the value? And the second question was, next slide, please. How does sustainability, in our context, it's carbon performance, influence the value of the formula? So this is actually a very, very easy formula. To answer the question, we developed different scenarios driven by political decisions or changing market environment. This is just for your rough information in the first couple of minutes. I will now hand over to BPIE to Zolt, who will give you some more details on our observations and assumptions for future developments. Thanks a lot.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Ivan Jankovic, and I hope you can see my screen. I will, in the next couple of slides, present the regulatory environment behind the carbon performance real estate valuation. A few words about BPIE at the beginning. We are a Brussels-based think tank with an office also in Berlin. And what we do is independent research on different aspects and focusing on building performance And we support policymakers, but also different industries regarding these topics, and different research is our focus. As I said, in next couple of slides, I will present regulatory environment, but mostly I will focus on two topics. It is to explain link between these two, regulatory environment and potential for carbon performance valuation of real estate. And another focus is to explain potential valuation drivers that we noticed within different countries and the regulatory environments. So if we start from the EU level, we can definitely say that we all know about EU energy and CO2 targets, and we could hear their echo in Green Deal and renovation wave. But what we would like to present today and to put focus on today is that these targets are definitely ambitious. And the second thing is that these targets has been constantly updated and tightened. And although how targets can be reached may still be under discussion, it is clear that there is a determination that these targets are kept very ambitious. This implies that we can all count on these CO2 and energy targets affecting and changing our economy and affecting different industries, where real estate will be one of the industries that will have to adapt to changes to come the most, I would say. To explain all these efforts, we can mention two examples. The first example is something that you see in the graph shown here. But just to make it simpler for you, we can see that if we say that something like 2050 is a long-term plan and 2030 short-term one, we can notice that between 2011 and 2016, there was a significant increase in greenhouse gas emissions targets. So in 2011 it was 30, and then 2016 it was 45. So significant increase. Another example is EU taxonomy that we all know about, and EU taxonomy is one of the tools for low carbon economy and transition to low carbon economy. Requires that every investment that is marketed as low carbon investment will have to be assessed, and its impact and contribution to low carbon economy will have to be analyzed. What we're discussing today here is analysis of CO2 reduction, and connection to EU taxonomy is that one of the main tools for assessing low carbon investments will be carbon metrics, and that is why we can all expect CO2 performance as an indicator of contribution to low carbon economy to have increased importance in years to come. If we go from EU level to country level, through a couple of examples, as I said before, we will try to present some potential drivers for valuation of real estate, taking into account CO2 performance. The first example can be found in Netherlands, and that is Netherlands is a good example of strict technical requirements. The graph, a small graph that you see in upper left corner, actually means energy coefficient requirements are tightened on average at average rate of 3% per year, which means that Netherlands pays a lot of attention to technical requirements. And another important thing in Netherlands is that according to the latest policies, office buildings will have energy label C after 2023, or they will be excluded from the market. which could be a very strong driver for valuation of CO2 performance, since non-compliance with this requirement will imply high losses. And that is why we think it can be a very strong driver for CO2 valuation, but this is what we will see later throughout the tool. Then if we move quickly to Sweden, Denmark, and Netherlands, these countries are important and interesting for us because they are examples of high energy prices from fossil fuels. And we know that high energy prices can affect cash flow, and they affect cash flow generated by different assets. And the higher energy prices are, the higher monetary savings from energy renovation will be. So in this sense, reduced OPEX, operating expense, in case of an efficient building may be a potential driver for valuation from high energy prices. Another example, another positive example is France. What is interesting in case of France, that it is characterized by significant financial support to building renovation. When we talk about financial support, it can, for example, reduce CapEx, capital expenditures, or it can reduce interest expenses, but in both ways it can improve financial sustainability of the investment. And in ideal case, there is another effect, another interesting effect, that we would expect this to support the renovation industry and to lead to more buildings being renovated, which can make highly efficient buildings and highly efficient real estate market standard, which would then reduce value of non-efficient buildings. We can go just quickly through the case of Germany. Germany is an example of ambitious target, but still not very efficient implementation. And to make it short, in case of Germany, we think that some changes will be needed and will happen in the future. And our suggestion to real estate markets and industry there is that they should definitely closely follow the situation and be ready to adjust itself to changes in legislation about to come. This is my last slide, actually, and I would avoid repeating what I just said in previous slides, but I would add something on practitioners' views on this topic. And I would say that apart from legislation, price of energy, financial issues, we have to emphasize that execution and engagement from different parties in CO2 valuation is very, very important. And in that sense, it is very important to understand, even if we have a perfect regulatory environment for CO2 valuation in buildings, it is still very important to understand certain aspects, such as who will order valuation, what are the data needs and where they can be found, what is available now and what will have to be available in the future, and also what are the skill gaps and what are the skills needed for both valuers and their clients to effectively implement CO2 valuation of buildings. With this, I would finish my presentation and thank you all for your participation, and then quickly ask Zsolt and Caroline to proceed.
Thanks, Ivan. This is Anne speaking. I'm taking over now. Just a short question. Can you all see my screen? I have now shared it and I've received a feedback that it should be there.
Yes, however, we see your next slide. If you can put it in full screen presentation mode.
Yeah, 1 minute. It's Is it better now?
Yes, perfect. Thanks.
Great. Okay, thank you everybody. Thank you, Ivan. Thank you, Suzanne, for making the introduction. Short introduction of myself and the team I'm working in. Working at PWC at the Sustainability Services, we're having here, in subsequently a growing team that is working on the measurement of climate risk, evaluating the financial impacts of climate risk, and having, among others, also a focus on the real estate sector. So measuring how the impacts of climate change could affect financially the real estate sector, and in particular, approached in this project the value of buildings. First of all, maybe we have talked also in the last presentation very much about the impact and potential additional costs that might occur, but of course climate change may also offer opportunities. So maybe one of a very important beginning statement, we're not looking only at risk, but we're also looking at how values of buildings or buildings itself can increase in value due to changing market requirements or effects that we see coming from climate change. As an introduction, a short review on the past month, what has been done within the project, which has taken us nearly 1 year to complete several steps, and during a neat and proper assessment of the topic. As Suzanne introduced, the question was how climate change could affect the valuation practice and the building value. And as such, we started with an analysis, first of all, to see which or how buildings are evaluated. We worked here also together with the PWC practice of building valuators that are doing this on their daily job. And also conducted, I think, about 40 interviews with experts in the area and experts from companies that shared their knowledge, their views with us on this topic, leading us to a very conceptual question that was, or one of the central conceptual questions was, do we really need to change current valuation approaches, for example, adding an additional factor or anything else, or do we already have the methodology at hand and we just need to integrate climate risk into considerations when calculating these factors? And I will get to that at one of the next slides a bit more in detail. But basically, we on this analysis and the interview study, we were able to identify that mostly the financing use cases for building valuation were the ones most likely to have more degrees of freedom to integrate climate risk in it, as they are mostly forward-looking and they are having a strong focus on the actual building value, and they are a little bit less regulated as the use cases for others, like, for example, in accounting. As a second step, we were analyzing the influence of individual policy and regulatory instruments in the context of climate risk. here, this was also where BPIE was leading, providing their insights about climate policy and potential regulatory instruments. Based on these two steps, we started developing a model that has taken several steps as we were trying to validate this over the range of, I think in total, 3 stakeholder workshops, again, where we invited many people, as shown in Susan's slide earlier, who has contributed to the slide, many real estate investors, building holders, real estate departments of bigger retail companies, for example. So really a multitude of stakeholders, including also the standard setters, that finally led us to a relatively validated approach, which we tested with 4 frontrunners, which offered to take here a lead and let us test on their on portfolio data from them. You see them here in names that were mainly Redefco, TLG, Real Estate, Berlin Hüb, and Union Investment, which led us to an improvement of the final tool, which will be available for free at all our partners' websites during the course of April. We have here maybe also a bit of a delay due to the current situation where some departments have now other priorities taking care of the crisis that we are currently in. Nevertheless, the tool is finished. And we have taken a few steps. And before I'm getting in the detail, maybe the main takeaways that we have identified. We see that, or what are the main takeaways based on the analysis also of the test portfolio. So first of all, first finding was maybe not very surprising. Energy efficient buildings face less material climate risks and have a high potential for value increase. We see that buildings with a poor energy performance may decrease their value due to capex requirements that could be enforced with a stricter regulation, as we see it, for example, in the Netherlands. We see that in this case, the biggest value decreases are related to usage restrictions. In this case, taking the exemplary regulation from the Netherlands. And last but not least, the CO2 price, which we also talked about earlier already, and that is often pretty much maybe also politically discussed as a hot topic, has shown to have a very little effect on the building value, which might or might not come as a surprise, but just taking this into a relative position, it seems that the CO2 price, at least also with the current setting, but also with a higher increase, would require a very high value to really have here an impact on the value. As takeaways from these findings, we see a need that, or we see first of all that there is a huge market potential for energy efficient building as they face less risk. But in order to identify which buildings can be bought or invested in future, a systematic portfolio screening of asset holders will be required. So they need tools in order to understand how their portfolio buildings are positioned, and also in order to define criteria how to develop the portfolio over time. For example, do I have a criteria which kind of technology a building should have from 2030 onwards in order to align with the climate targets, for example. And as a last point related to this portfolio screening, I think it's not a secret that currently the biggest problem lies within the existing buildings and their need for energetic renovation. So we see that we need to, or asset holders would need to develop renovation and financing strategies in order to mobilize the required investment and to enable a financially stable transformation of the portfolio stock. Based on the time, I'm jumping here. So we have modeled four simulations. The first one was the introduction of a carbon tax. This carbon tax started with the also by some scientific sources recommended a price of over 40 euros and increased over time subsequently to 175 euros. So it's significantly higher than what we see in current plans, for example, in Germany, but comes closer to what we see already in other countries, taking Switzerland as an example of, I think, 80 Swiss francs per ton. Secondly, we have modeled the common minimum energy efficiency standards for buildings in 2025. This is more or less inspired by the Dutch regulation that is in place. Here, as the tool is for Germany, we said that in 2025, the energy target of 100 kilowatt hours per square meter needs to be achieved in order to not lose the license to operate, so to further let and sell buildings. Third one is the restriction of the climate strategy. So assuming that governments will impose or make mandatory their climate strategies and also put the required regulation behind, as we have seen in the graphs shown by Ivan earlier, we assume that there will be at a certain point of time a mandatory renovation for all buildings that are above these 100 kilowatt hours per square meter and therefore need a renovation at a certain point of time, but not necessarily already in 2025 as in the first example. The last simulation that we modeled was the change in demand. So here, assuming based on a restriction, we get a shortage or a smaller building stock on the market, we can assume that especially the demand for energy efficient buildings will increase, and that we see here that these buildings potentially can generate higher rent income than they could before, so they are increasing their cash flows. Before we look at the results, also this is what I told you before, the individual simulations options mapped to an illustrative calculation approach for buildings. This formula is based on the German income approach, but has been a bit stylized in order to represent also on an international scale the main steps to be taken or components to be considered when doing building valuation. So more or less a learning of the project was also that even names of valuation approaches are different. We see that more or less the same components in all formulas somewhere appear. That's why we're using this as a basis to demonstrate that, for example, the carbon tax, as outlined, would have an impact on the annual cost generated so a deduction of the income required. And of course, here's the question if it's to be paid by the landlord or the tenant. We have assumed that the landlord has to take it in this case, even though we see that it's not in all countries or not in current regulation always like this. To see here from the landlord perspective, having an extreme case, what would be the effect? We have taken this assumption. Second one is the ordinance law, so to tighten energy efficiency standards. This is what we explained with the operating license and the restrictions of usage. So we see here either the residual life to be affected. Additionally, we see in total a higher risk with the building, so that the multiple will potentially change. And we also see an impact, of course, on required invest that would need to be invested in order to maintain or keep the operating license. Fourth, we see the demand side mostly has an impact on the income. Here, another aspect that has not been modeled is, of course, that potentially technology is getting cheaper and that we have additional subsidies. We have not modeled this explicitly, as it more or less affects the volume of invest. So it could affect or could lead to lower investments as technology is getting cheaper or subsidized. And as a last point, the National Climate Risk Strategy, we see here also the need for investment, but we also see that potentially the multiple could be affected in order based on the risk profile of a building that is not in line anymore with regulatory standards. Being considerate of time, shortly looking at the assumptions. So the tool is made for non-residential buildings. It's Excel-based. The approach is now based on a discounted cash flow model that is more or less, as I said, a good common denominator for the international building building valuation practice. It allows to do the valuation for a period of up to 30 years, but the user can use how long, can adjust the valuation period. The energy consumption refers to the final energy demand, and the renovation costs are derived by a regressive cost curve starting at 1,200 euro for a building with 250 kilowatt hours per square meter. This is an average value which we derived from earlier study together with DENEFF, and which had been proven quite accurate to be in this context. Having a look at the results, here you see in summary that we have here results based on an average building that more or less reflects also maybe the portfolios that we have analyzed. We have stylized this building example in 3 ways. So we have a high energy consumption, a medium energy consumption, and a low energy consumption. So the same building in 3 different options. And if we're looking at the results of the individual regulations that or policies that have been modeled, we see, as mentioned, a relatively small effect on the CO2 tax, but we see a relatively higher effect on the on both regulations or on both policies that require a mandatory renovation. This is the cost to keep the license to operate. So in other words, basically the building value here in this case is showing the decrease by the required invest. However, and this is very important, this is just the stress test view in this context. Of course, it could be that after the renovation, this building would be able to generate significantly more rent income than before, and it significantly increase in value again. And then, as said, these changes in demand are perfectly possible due to an expected tightening of the markets. We see here that especially the low carbon or the low energy buildings increase in value, whereas the high energy buildings have a decrease. This is relatively low. We have taken here quite conservative assumptions on how much rents would increase. It's important here that even though we had 40 expert interviews, we had 3 workshops talking to experts and looking in literature, it's very difficult based on the current market situation to have a concrete or very precise estimation of the price elasticity in regard to how would the price or market rent for energy efficient buildings increase in future. So it's a topic that we will take up in future projects. And that's why we have chosen here to take a relatively conservative approach. Looking now at the time, I have one last point to make, and that's that especially the medium energy buildings are interesting to see, because they are potentially not required to be renovated by 2025, but at a later point of time. And when we look at what is currently usual time frame for building valuation, we mostly hear that it is around 10 years, maybe sometimes 15 years. And in this context, we see that based on our valuation tool here, there's a potential risk that an investment requirement could be overlooked. So if an investor now has looks for a certain object that fits into his strategy, and he's maybe willing, or he's looking to decarbonize his portfolio, he might overlook something if he just takes the valuation for 10 years. As in year 11 or 12, the medium energy building potentially would strand in the context of the climate strategy and require investments for energetic upgrade. So I think this is also where we would position the tool in order to get a first understanding how values could change, to get a first understanding how the own portfolio looks like, and how also the topic of climate change that is often qualitatively only assessed could be taken from maybe historically the sustainability officers towards the evaluators within the companies, in order to get us to be sensitive for the topic, and in order to start changing practice and think from a strategic point about the financial impact of climate risks. So I would open up now for questions, if there are any immediate questions.
I don't see any immediate questions.
Okay.
Therefore, I think we can move on to the next agenda item, which is the panel discussion. Thank you for the presentation, and thank you also to the previous speakers. My name is Zsolt Todt. I'm Senior Project Manager at BPIE, and I will be your moderator for the short Q&A session, with the audience. But before giving the floor to questions, we will hear two very quick reactions from our panel. I would first like to introduce you Diana Barglazan, who is the team leader at the Energy Directorate of the European Commission, the Energy Efficiency Finance Unit. Diana has been directly involved with the EU's sustainable finance taxonomy work, as well as with the EFIG. And as we heard, legislation is probably the most important driver for value differentiation in the real estate sector. Diana will comment from the perspective of policymakers. Diana will be followed by Ursula Hartenberger. She is the Global Head of Sustainability at RICS, a global organization representing professionals across the entire life cycle of real estate, and that includes also property valuers. Ursula is a member of the technical expert group supporting the Commission on the Sustainable Finance Initiative, and she will provide insights from the perspective of both the practicing valuers as well as the recently released final taxonomy report. So Diana, Ursula, I would like to welcome you both. And Diana, you are the first then to take the floor.
Yes, thank you very much, Schultz. Yeah, it's a very interesting project, and I'm happy to see the assessment done and the details into which it went. I see also that the role of the regulation is highlighted. I think to some extent we are aware that the regulation can have a very strong impact. It also depends how it is done. So maybe I will share a bit my view on this. Quite often when we talk about regulation and when from a policy point of view we take into account some actions, we kind of think about both incentives and obligations that can be imposed, sometimes called a carrot and stick approach. And most of the time, if not always, the idea is to start with incentives, trying to set up the right incentives to convince the market to align to our policy view and objectives. And if this happens, I think it's the best scenario, because when the market is actively involved in finding and developing solutions, these solutions are able to take into account very well all the specificities at local level and for each of the market in particular. It's not always very easy and it doesn't always work, but I think this is a very good solution and a very good idea for the market participants to pay attention to the policy signals and, to the extent possible, try to proactively find solutions. Complementary to that, and in particular if the incentives do not work very well, the other alternative is to impose obligations. And what we have noticed is that these obligations indeed are very effective. They have a very strong impact and very quick changes follow. However, they can be quite disruptive. They can be not so well perceived, not so much appreciated by the actors who are obliged to comply with such new obligations. So this is also why it's very, very rare to start directly with very strict obligations. However, I think that policy signals and, for example, setting targets and providing communications and guidance can send quite can show quite clearly in which direction it goes. So yeah, in terms of regulation, what else? I would like to say that for now, for buildings, of course, the main directive in place is the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, and the metrics that are considered are mainly energy metrics. There are carbon metrics considered, but they can be included by member states on a voluntary basis as complementary to energy metrics in energy performance certificates, for example. However, I think also Ursula will mention more about that. we have received recommendations from the technical expert group on sustainable finance, and for buildings, in order to consider them as environmentally sustainable, the recommendation is building on the existing legislation and tools and indicators, and including energy metrics. But the recommendation is clear in the sense that the Commission should look and consider adding carbon metrics and look much more into this area. And I think for now I will stop here.
Thank you, Diana. I think this is very useful, because probably the question of what preoccupies most the real estate industry today is how exactly the transition to zero carbon will play out. But this may be something that we can come back to it a bit later on. Ursula, I will hand it over to you straight away, and maybe you will be able to provide also a more concrete and practical view of what has been said until now. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Zsolt, and thank you very much also to Diana for having already introduced the work of the TEC. I'm going to be briefly talking about how carbon has been dealt with within the taxonomy for sustainable finance, and then reflect upon some potential solutions and also some potential barriers in making the tool operational, which also will need to be addressed. So I don't seem to be able to shift my slides. Oh, no, sorry. Yeah, so I would like to start off with a bit of a reality check here. What we came across when we were developing the taxonomy criteria for the buildings is a lack of consistent data across countries for benchmarking the building stock performance. This has been our biggest obstacle, really. And this is not something new, because we've carried out a number of projects also on valuation that were funded by the European Commission. And whenever we were talking to valuers across Europe, the biggest issue for them to consider energy efficiency as part of their valuation work and as part of their valuation reports was really the lack of data. And when I'm saying the lack of data on energy efficiency, I think it's also important to mention that this went far beyond energy efficiency. Sometimes even the most basic data wasn't really available. Then what we were also coming across is that large parts of the market are not really ready to work with carbon emissions. Diana was already indicating that, but that may work for big commercial developers or occupiers and owners. But for smaller commercial buildings, and certainly also for the residential sector, this is far more challenging. And that presents a real challenge for the valuer, because the valuer needs to base its valuation on his or her valuation on reliable data. And if that data is not there, you will only see a limited visible impact on value, even though the building may be energy efficient. But if you haven't got energy efficiency, if you haven't got the data, it's very, very difficult. So, which is why the evidence has only been coming through in a very sluggish way. So now. I can't move the slides. I don't know why that is. Here we are. So what we have here is basically just one example of one of the activities that were deemed eligible under the EU taxonomy. So I'm focusing here on the construction of new buildings, which also from a sort of whole life carbon accountancy and assessment perspective is probably much easier than looking at the existing stock. So here you see the criteria. Some of you will be familiar with those criteria, and you can see that we have developed a criteria, against the background of all these challenges that I've been talking about just now. We have developed a trajectory and have tasked the Future Sustainable Finance Platform within our set of recommendations to introduce and define also net zero carbon requirements by 2030.
Ursula, apologies for interrupting you, because it seems that your slides are not moving. So I would ask maybe Caroline to put her backup slides on the screen, so then
that's a
the
good idea,
audience can follow the slides. Apologies.
I don't seem to be able to move them.
Again.
Yeah.
Just one sec.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you. Right, so we've had a lot of commentary from stakeholders as part of the two rounds of consultations that we held, that it was important not just to reflect the operational carbon, but also reflecting the embodied carbon of a building. While we completely agree that this is an important aspect to actually get to net zero, the challenges that I outlined earlier are even more valid when we get to embodied carbon, because the data for that is very scarce. So on the basis of that, we could not really feel we were not able to include embodied carbon thresholds in the taxonomy. So, but we have actually developed again some recommendations for the Future Sustainable Finance Platform, and with regard to this, is to gather and analyze existing data to establish reliable thresholds for carbon emissions embodied in new constructions, and also define a methodology adopted to assess embodied emissions. So, and of course, this should be really in parallel to the trajectory that I was talking about earlier. So, how do you do that in practice? I mean, how do you actually assess the whole life carbon life cycle of a building? Can I have the next slide, please? We have, because the goal really should be that, there's been a lot of talk about the vicious circle of blame over the years. That started in the early 2000s. I've slightly adapted that because what we really would need to get to in order to reflect the the carbon performance of a building within valuations is that we first need to have that data. That will lead to improved benchmarking. That will also mean that it's going to be considered within valuation reports, and then we can discern and identify the potential positive impact on value, and that in turn will then hopefully also increase the demand, which in turn then will also make more data available. So I was talking about a practical tool. Next slide, please. I mean, we've been from the question is, of course, where is this data going to come from? So from an RICS point of view, we've created the RICS Whole Life Carbon Database. This is built on the Whole Life Carbon Assessment for the built environment, a guidance note that we issued in 2017. This is to allow users to identify where associated carbon emissions reductions can be made during all stages of the life cycle. And the way it works is that organizations who submit project data, the database can be then used freely. And in the next step of this piece of work is that we are actually going to look at the value of whole life cycle carbon. There are just internal discussions going on because this is also obviously something that we would also need to turn into skills and knowledge for our values. So I'm going to leave it at that, and I'm looking forward to receiving questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ursula. It's great that you have already hinted at potential data sources, because I guess my most immediate question to both you and Diana would have been how we are going to ensure that sufficient amount of data will be available for valuers. It seems that people are tired already of hearing too often that data availability is an issue. But that doesn't mean that the issue has been resolved or it has been decreased in importance. So if data availability metrics and comparable evidence is the most important barrier when valuing energy efficiency, as it has proved over the last 10 years, is this even more the case when we are valuing carbon? Ursula, would you like to continue on this note?
Yeah, I think it's not so much also a question of simply saying there's not any data, because that is not really true, because there is data available. It's just not systematically captured and managed and presented, and therefore it's very difficult for valuers to access it. Because I mean, we must not forget that it's not data sourcing might be part of the job, but it's not constant data mining. So we need to find ways whereby this data is presented in an accessible, user-friendly, consistent way, and that the data is also verified and validated for its quality. Because if you get bad data, you get bad results. So the data needs to be reliable, trustworthy. So we're now working at the level of the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction. We're working on guidelines for developing building passports, and that the building passport is essentially a data repository where all data from the life cycle can be stored or tagged to. The idea is that, of course, this needs to be digital, and that would be a great help for the valuers to access relevant data. And to make assessments in relation to value when it comes to the carbon performance of the asset.
Thank you, Ursula. Before turning to Diana to talk about what the Commission is doing in terms of improving data availability, I just quickly want to remind the audience to submit their questions. We can read their questions, and I can pick up on these and pose it to the speakers and the panelists. Okay. In the meantime, Diana, would you care to comment on this?
Yes. Well, I think I would start by saying that data availability is a big issue and a big challenge, and more and more recently, this is one of the main topics in the discussions about sustainable energy, about buildings, also about energy efficiency. So for now, at the Commission level, I think we have been focusing over the last years more on data availability for energy efficiency and on energy consumption. But I mean, not exclusively. For example, we have built with the Energy Efficiency Financial Institutions Group a database that was launched in 2016 called the Risking Energy Efficiency Platform. And there, basically, until now, there are over 10,000 projects. The idea is to provide data about energy performance, technical performance of these investments, and also financial performance. Now, of course, we are discussing with the contractor to adjust this database, and they have already made a few steps based on the previous interim recommendations and suggestions of the technical expert group. So they already included a few extra fields. Definitely, this will continue, and the idea is to adjust this database and to bring it much more in line with the taxonomy as it is developed. There are other initiatives at EU level, for example, the Energy Efficiency Mortgage Initiative. There, the discussion is also a lot about data availability, and this seems to be a real issue. Strictly on carbon, I think, at least on our side, in DG Energy, we have not done a lot because carbon metrics are currently not included in the legislation. However, at the Commission level, there are some efforts. For example, our colleagues in DG Environment are trying to build up data on carbon and also on embedded carbon through levels. And one idea that was discussed already and it's explored, we don't really know yet if this will fit in taxonomy and a delegated act or not. But one idea discussed is to try to first include a reporting obligation for companies. So to ask them to provide data on carbon before introducing carbon metrics. So that could be an option explored. And then, of course, we are happy to see all kinds of projects and market initiatives that go in this direction and that contribute to building up data and making it available.
Thank you, Diana. I was just picking up one comment or likely a question from the audience, highlighting the issue of privacy around data sharing. That's maybe something, again, also for the legislators to look at. And just connected to that, the issue of data and metrics. Ursula was talking about the virtuous circle. The question is, of course, what should come first, the development of carbon metrics or just the collection of the data? Or is this something like a chicken and egg question? Diana? Or Ursula, feel free to go ahead.
I mean, from my perspective, you cannot develop a metric without having at least a sufficiently large pool of data. So I'm not saying it has to be one or the other, but you have to do these efforts in parallel, and then fine tune the metrics as you go along, because otherwise you're just developing a metric basically into a black hole.
Yes, I think I will also agree with that. And as I was mentioning, one of the idea we discussed with colleagues from the environment as well, also on embedded carbon, was to maybe start by introducing some reporting obligations and then collecting data. And once we have sufficient data, including metrics. At the same time, I must say that also the approach of announcing that in the future there will be introduced clear metrics on carbon and maybe even trying to develop them can definitely trigger more incentives and more efforts for gathering this data and for building up this data. But I fully agree with Ursula. It's probably very difficult to include some clear metrics and also thresholds without really seeing the data, because it might be very wrong in terms of the level chosen.
Thank you, Diana. I am just conscious of time. I will turn quickly to Anne. I would like to ask her how essentially successful future-proofing of an asset is dependent on the right strategy and the proper implementation of the strategy, and how can a valuer assess this, and what are the available metrics, just to connect to the previous questions. And someone again from the public was asking if climate change will bring health impacts for individuals occupying or using these buildings. Are they, again, additional metrics or ways to incorporate these in asset valuations?
Thanks, George. Maybe starting with the first question, what could be metrics? And I think Diana as well as Ursula have brought up a bit this topic about data availability and making or creating metrics. And I mean, at the end, we are talking about climate pathways. So our metric ideally would be CO2. And as we trying to get closer to this, we're using energy efficiency performance as a proxy, as this gives us a measure and is at least for some cases, and here I fully agree with the two speakers before, we have a lack of consistent gathering of this data. So using this kind of information is for me the one side of the medal that is, for example, also asked by the recommendations of the TCFD, Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So having this perspective, am I with my building portfolio on the right way? Am I, for example, on a below 2 degree pathway? This would be for me the one side of the medal where I would try to identify KPIs or to measure my performance in terms of climate strategy. And the other side of the medal is for me, and that's also in line with the TCFD recommendations, looking at financial impact, so measuring by looking at which impacts could be material for my business and my impacts. And I think this would lead to the need of having a systematic assessment of the building portfolio in terms of financial risk. And then we somehow close the circle, because for this we also need energy efficiency or CO2 data. So I think this is the core, and maybe to adding what I think really nice initiatives they are now starting around the data problem is the question that should be answered in future as well is, are we finding means to at least approximate or estimate such data from the outside, and facilitating as such at least an approximative valuation or assessment of these risk and tracking KPIs. And can you shortly repeat the second question? I think that was something related to the tool.
Yeah, it was about accounting for health impacts, not just carbon emissions, because when we are talking about climate change, there are really wider impacts, and where do they fit into valuation models?
That's a very good question. We have not looked at these components within this project, but I think also BPIE is having a project in this direction, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I think we are all looking into these issues, because for valuers, I expect it's really difficult to disentangle the various impacts which can be financially relevant. So therefore, I think many people are actually highlighting this issue, that you need to look at the cross impacts and you need to take the wider sustainability questions in considerations. But having said that, I think we ran out of time and we are reaching the end of this webinar. I would like to thank you all for being with us today. I would like to thank you, the speakers, for their contributions and the generosity in sharing their views. So to wrap up this session, these are my parting thoughts. First of all, minimum performance standards are a key part of the strategic approach of the EU and the member states to significantly reduce carbon emissions. Meeting these targets requires improvements of much of the building stock, which will clearly have an impact on the property markets. So the key message to property owners, the property managers and the valuers is that they should be aware of the implications, and this tool which we have presented today can help all the market actors to better assess the associated risks and opportunities. Second, the past experience suggests that valuers are reluctant to take on sustainability issues in full, also because liability issues. So again, I see this tool can be an anchor point and an extremely important and timely additional resource to help their quantitative and qualitative reasoning. And finally, the discussion on data availability and the comparable evidence is, I think, a reminder that this is not just about providing the ultimate methodology or a quantitative analysis, but above everything, it is about the need to put the right sustainability due diligence processes in place and generally improve data access and data availability. That is to say, we all have a responsibility to contribute. So we heard from Anne that the tool will be made public towards the end of April at the PWC and other partners' websites. So please do not hesitate to come back to us. And I would very much like to thank you all for being with us this morning during these dark times, but sunny day at least here in Brussels. So take care and keep healthy.